I think one of the realities you also face is that when we look at these numbers and the deficits, you're borrowing at a historically low cost over at Treasury. You know, maybe your borrowing costs are 2.5%. If those go up to the average over the last 20 years, you're suddenly more than doubling the cost of borrowing. So the deficits we're talking about that are projected are going to get a lot worse. And if we could go back to the chart that shows the climb in entitlement costs, this is, you know, this is one of the concerns we have. If we go back to the 1970s and that argument over having both guns and butter, under LBJ, the Vietnam War, and the new entitlement spending, and all the social welfare spending, we tried to do both. And at that time, the Federal Reserve was a party to trying to assist in that. This is one of the arguments that some of your allies have made or your colleagues have made on the Federal Reserve. When they look back at the policies at the time, they say, well, the Fed tried to help accommodate the solution to that. Clearly, it couldn't be paid for at the time. And so one of the things they did was they put in place monetary policy that helped eventually create what was called the Great Inflation of the 1970s. Now, I think you might concur with this. I mean, as we move forward, we're sort of in the same position. And as we draw down and draw out the troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, as we draw this down, that's one thing we have to face, is reducing again the cost of the military budget. But we're also going to have to face this entitlement question. Some of these were set up on the premise that they'd be partly sort of an insurance program where people would pay in, right? And now they morph into a situation where eventually they gobble up such a huge percentage of the budget that it has to be faced as well. Otherwise, we put you in the untenable position of perhaps doing what was done in the late 60s and early 70s by the Fed, which might end up, again, with a great inflation. These are my concerns. I'd like you to speak for a minute about this issue and about the deficit and the steps that need to be taken on entitlements.
Certainly. So first, you're absolutely right about the interest rate problem. We're seeing that in Europe, where investors lose confidence in a country's fiscal situation. That drives up interest rates, that makes the deficit higher, and so you have a vicious circle that can be very hard to break. On entitlements, you're also correct that they're not true insurance programs. I think many Americans think the money they put in Social Security or in Medicare is somewhere in the bank someplace. That's not really quite right. What's happening mostly is that younger generations are paying through their taxes for older generations' benefits, and that worked okay as long as the population was shaped in a more like a pyramid instead of more like a rectangle, as it's becoming now the case. On monetary policy, you know, we've learned the lesson of the 1970s. We're in much better shape now because inflation expectations are much better anchored after many years of low and stable inflation. Since Paul Volcker brought inflation down in the 1980s, we're committed to.
But what if Congress doesn't do its part? What if we don't tackle entitlement spending? And what if this chart that we have up in terms of what drives our debt, what if that entitlement ramp up continues unabated? What then?
Well, I think the Fed, there are different views on this, and you can get very deeply into the discussion, but I believe that if the Fed refuses to accommodate or pay for this extra spending by money creation, that we can maintain control of inflation, but what will still happen will be much higher interest rates, which will have a very negative effect both on the deficit and on the private economy.
So it's imperative that we tackle now. And would you say a small solution to this will take care of the problem, or do we need to reach for that overarching true reform of entitlements that take care in the long haul of what's going to happen with Social Security, Medicare, and so forth?
Well, I recognize that these are complicated matters. They may not be able to be done in a few weeks, but I, like many other people who watch the budget developments, have been very excited by the idea that a very big program might be feasible, and that we might do something that would stabilize our debt over the next decade. That would be, I think, a tremendous accomplishment if Congress can find a way to do that.
I think if you can articulate the consequences if we don't, it might help the goal of getting the entitlement reforms done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.